Today I'm going to show you how to rebuild a GM 10-bolt rear differential with either the 8.5 or 8.6 inch ring gear. The GM used these differentials in many vehicles, but it's most commonly found in the trucks and SUVs, like the Chevy Tahoe, Avalanche, Silverado, and Suburban. It's also used in the GMC Sierra and Yukon and the Cadillac Escalade. The differential I'm rebuilding in this video is a 2007 Tahoe, GMT 900. The process should be very similar to other differentials. Just be aware that the specs and bolt sizes I mention are only relevant to this specific vehicle. You will need to source your own specs for your specific axle.
The very first step is to chock both front wheels in both directions. You don't necessarily have to go in both directions, but I just really like not dying, so I go ahead and err on the side of paranoia. However, you absolutely have to chock the front wheels, because obviously you're not going to be able to use your parking brake. This parking brake only engages the rear wheels. Okay, now go ahead and jack up the rear of the vehicle and get it as high as you comfortably can. But you might be tempted to put the jack stands under the rear axle itself, but you can't do that because you have to remove some suspension components in order to disassemble the differential. So the best spot to hit it is on the frame, as close to the mount point for the rear control arm as you can. Alright, drop the spare tire and get it out of there. Now you have to take loose this track bar. It's held on with two 21mm bolts, one on each side. You don't have to take that one off completely. Just have to loosen it, and then you can just kick it up and get it out of the way. Make sure you catch the cage nut on that comes out of the back there. Go ahead and unclip the emergency brake cable. This one was already mostly unclipped. And the other clip appears to be missing, so I'm going to have some fun locating that. I'll just tie the track bar up out of the way. Now you have to take loose the rear sway bar. Start by disconnecting the sway bar at the end links on both sides of the vehicle. That's going to take an 18mm socket and optionally a 3/4 or 19mm wrench to hold the stud here and keep it from counter rotating. Alright, just get that out of the sway bar and out of the way. Now you can just swing the sway bar down out of the way. You don't have to pull it out of its mounts. Now you have to detach the rear drive shaft. It's held on with 4 bolts, 2 on each side. Remove those with an 11mm socket. This thing feels a lot worse than I thought. Now it's time to start removing the rear diff cover. Remove these 10 bolts with a 13mm socket. Leave the top bolt in place because you're going to have to pop the cover and let the fluid drip out. And that keeps it from just completely spilling out. Alright, I guess this one wants to stay with that brake line bracket. Let's just get that out of the way. Alright, now take a flathead screwdriver and pry the cover. Break the seal. That is some nasty gear oil. At this point you can take that top bolt out. And check your magnet for your metal shavings collection. Found the bearing material. Now do yourself a favor and take some brake cleaner and just clean off the carrier and the carrier caps. It just makes things easier to handle. You don't have all that slimy gear oil all over you. And that's already one can down. Alright, if you're going to install wheel lights and you don't know what you're doing, make sure your life insurance is up to date. Make sure there's no caliper interaction. Look at this. Don't zip tie stuff to brake hoses. And now you have to completely remove the brakes on both sides, including caliper, caliper bracket, and rotor. Remove the 2 caliper slide pin bolts with a 13mm socket. You're usually going to have to hold the caliper slide pin bolt with at these flats. Just use a large wrench or a pair of pliers or something. And then get the one on the bottom. Just grab the caliper, pull it off, and set it inside somewhere. Just make sure it's somewhere secure because you don't want it to be hanging by the brake hose. Wow, just about got all the life out of that pad. Now remove the 2 caliper bracket bolts with an 18mm socket. At this point you can remove the rotor. If your rotor is stuck on from rust or whatever, there's these 2 threaded holes here that you can use to insert bolts to push it away from the wheel hub. Here's a pro tip. Your differential bearing shouldn't sound like that. Alright, now rotate the carrier until you find the pin retaining bolt. Right here. Now take a 19mm wrench, get it on one of the ring gear bolts, and then remove that pin retaining bolt with an 8mm socket. Now rotate the carrier, and that retaining pin is going to slide out. It might need a little bit of help because it's probably a little bit gummed up. There it is. Alright, one side at a time. Push the axle shafts in as far as they'll go. Might have to work it a little. Now just rotate the carrier until you can see the C-clip. And then take a little magnet tool. Just put it in there and try to get that C-clip out. There we go. There's one on each axle shaft. Alright, once that C-clip is free, go ahead and pull the axle shaft out. Sometimes it's necessary to put the pry bar to work to break loose the axle bearing. Just try not to damage your emergency brake shoes too much. It usually doesn't take very much. Alright, just pull this out about a foot or so. Make sure it's clear of the carrier. Now do exactly the same thing for the other side. Okay, now you can start removing the carrier. But there's a few important notes. These bearing caps are align honed with the axle, and they have to go back on the exact same side and in the exact same orientation that they came off. So find some way to mark which side is the top. You can take note of the position of the numbers there. They face the outside of the axle housing. Take lots of pictures, make some marks, make some non-damaging marks. Once you're satisfied with that, go ahead and remove the 2 bolts. And these are SAE bolts, so you remove them with a 5/8 socket. Now take the bearing caps loose, but don't completely remove them yet. We're going to use them to keep the carrier from just completely falling out when we go to remove it. Alright, and here's one more important note. If you're not changing the gears, you have to keep track of these shim stacks and which side they're on. So the gear contact pattern is controlled by these shim stacks to adjust the carrier in either direction. If you're not changing the gears, you really don't have to worry about making adjustments, but you do have to worry about keeping track of where they came from on each side, and obviously not losing any of them. Now you got to pry the carrier out of the housing. Now if you have the G80 posi traction locker, rotate it to the side that doesn't have all those mechanical bits, because that's where we're gonna attach our claw hammer to pry the carrier out. And these things usually give a pretty good fight. If it really won't cooperate, you're gonna have to get a jack involved. If you have to go to this extent, make triple sure that the hammer is not prying against any of the gears, including the spider gears on the inside of the carrier, and go as just as slow as you can, because this is kind of sketchy. Alright, there we go. As soon as you see the carrier come loose, get rid of the jack. At this point, completely remove a cap on the one side. Now carefully remove the other cap. Just hold the carrier in there. And then get hold of the shim stack, at least on one side. Alright. Once you've secured one side of the shim stacks, just pull it out, set it aside, but make sure you remember what side it went on until you get this carrier out. Go. Now immediately take the shim stack and mark it. Now you have to remove the pinion nut. Make sure you save this washer. Most rebuild kits don't come with it. So I highly recommend doing everything you can to get hold of an impact gun like this for removing that nut, because the alternative is just terrible. You have to get a giant pipe wrench and clamp the yoke, and then try to find somewhere where it'll fetch up. Then take the biggest breaker bar you've ever seen and crank that nut off, and it's not easy at all. Impact makes short work of it, quick and easy. Even if you can find an electric one, it doesn't necessarily have to be an air-powered Aircat like this one. Save the pinion nut, because you're going to need that for the shop press operation. Come to the other side and grab the pinion, pull her through. Alright, now that the pinion's out, you can start working on getting that seal out of there. There's no better time to replace this seal. And once that's out, grab the outer bearing. Oh, this thing's nasty. Now once that's done, you can start knocking out those bearing races. There's no point in using the bearing race driver to remove these races, so I just use a bunch of old extensions to catch the lip of the race, and just alternate between the top and the bottom of the race. Oh, there she goes. Now go to the other side, and it's time to knock out this inner race. So on this one I go side to side because there's reliefs cut in the differential housing. Go ahead and inspect the bearing surface on the axle shafts. Just clean it up and check for any galling. This one looks pretty good.
We do have some wear here where the axle seal is, but I might be able to get away with that. Alright, now go ahead and pull both axle shafts completely out. Alright, I'm going to knock off some of this dirt here, trying very carefully not to get it inside of the axle bearing. Alright, now I'm going to go ahead and remove the axle seal, because that I am definitely replacing. When in doubt, use a bigger pry bar. Honestly, this bearing looks perfectly fine. So I think I'm gonna leave this alone. Hopefully the other side is this good. There's not a hint of galling or anything on these. Now what I like to do is take some shop rags or something, wad them up, and then force them into the axle tube. And then just take something to shove it on through all the way until it comes out of the center chunk. You'll just have to find something that fits down the entire length of the axle tube. You could use the axle shafts for this, but they're big and they're heavy, unwieldy. I do that several times. Just look at all the metal shavings that's picking up. Well, that is one dirty rear, so I developed an apparatus for some more intense cleaning. I figure it'll go something like this. I gotta say, that worked a lot better. Oh my. Alright, be sure to thoroughly clean the center section. Go ahead and clean up the yoke. Now do your bench a favor and put some cardboard down, because gear oil just stinks forever. Now go to your bearing splitter set and grab the large bearing splitter. We're going to go ahead and get one side completely off. And we're going to run these nuts about all the way out as far as they'll go, because we need every bit of threads. Alright, just take the two halves and clamp them around the bearing. Now you gotta kind of do some dexterity acrobatics here. Hold the two sides together and thread these nuts on. And now before you tighten these, you want to make sure that the bearing splitter isn't biting into the carrier assembly itself. Now you're going to go ahead and set up the puller standoffs. Top plate in place. Now you're gonna have to find something that fits inside of here, something that's a large enough diameter where it doesn't go down in the hole, but is a small enough diameter to not interfere with the bearing race. I found that this old piece of power steering pump puller tool kit that I had once upon a time fits in there perfectly. All right, washers, nuts. They don't have to be tight. Take a forcing screw. Try to get it as centered as you can. Triple check again, make sure you're not biting the carrier assembly. Just go ahead and start cranking it down on the forcing screw. And there you go. Now sometimes it might be necessary to cut the bearing cage just to get rid of the cage and all the rollers, and that makes it easier to access the inner race. Before you do that, just take some precautions, cover things up to keep metal shavings from getting in places. Also be very careful not to hit the carrier. Once you're through that, just expand the cage and everything should fall apart. Make sure none of these go down inside the carrier. I see some evidence that somebody might have worked on this carrier before. There's a cut mark right there where it looks like somebody cut an old race off. It's not a good sign. I never like when I'm not the first person to have worked on something. Specifically for that reason, because I would have never cut the carrier. And also when I see something like that, it means I can't trust any of the shim stacks or the contact patterns or anything. So it just got slightly more complicated for me. Alright, so I'm having no luck with the bearing splitter, so I'm probably going to have to resort to cutting this off. So yeah, we're just going to go ahead and cut that off. So let's cover it back up. There we go. Now look, you can clearly see where they cut it, but you can't see where I cut it. The trick is you want to cut it just barely enough to where the tension on the hardened metal is enough to just break it. That way your cutting edge never actually has to come to close contact with the bearing surface. If you look at the back side of this, it just cracked rather than being cut. So if you have to cut it, do it like that. Man, look at that bearing. Every single roller has galling. And it looks like our friends with the angle grinder did a number on this pinion gear too. Alright, well, just like the carrier, we have to get this old bearing off. Now the thing about using the bearing splitter on the pinion bearing is there is a shim in between the bearing and the gear itself. You don't want to damage that shim. You just want to get it just barely enough under there where it has a good grip and you can get it out with the shop press. Alright, I went ahead and removed the cage and the rollers because I'm just not getting a good bite with the bearing splitter. I'm going to assume based on the flex of that bearing splitter that this is not going to go well. That race hasn't budged even a little bit. So we're just going to have to go ahead and cancel this and get the cutting wheel again. Yeah, what a piece of crap. I am not going to be writing home about this bearing splitter. Yep, sheared those threads clean off. Garbage. Well, that took some doing. Just look at the sludge buildup behind that. It's crazy. Now I'll go ahead and pull off the pinion shim. Make sure you put it in a safe spot. We're going to clean this gear like it's never been cleaned before.